Good morning, Mr. Ian Anderson. Thank you very much for doing this. I appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks. Welcome.
The listener, you were the former CEO of Trans Mountain Pipeline along with Kinder Morgan Canada, but maybe to get it from the source, what is the Trans Mountain Pipeline?
Well, that's a good question because it's a lot of things and it's been a lot of things over the years. So it's the only major conduit for Canadian crude to a coast in Canada. It moves from Edmonton to Burnaby, BC. It's got three main markets it serves. It serves the Lower Mainland refined products, so gasoline and diesels moving on Trans Mountain, and they service that whole Lower Mainland right into the interior, into the Kamloops region. It also serves a good portion of the feedstock for Washington State refineries. It peels off at Sumas and goes down to Washington State, provides 250,000 barrels a day into Washington State, and that's principally light crude. And then there's the dock where we move heavy crudes to markets now much broader than we used to. It used to be principally California destined transits from Burnaby, heavy crude down to California. There'd be ships moving up and down the coast. Now, obviously, with the expansion, it goes much farther than that into Asia and other markets globally.
You oversaw the pipeline between Kinder Morgan and the separate entity for about 17 years.
I did.
If I'm correct.
I did. Yeah, I joined Trans Mountain in 2005, moved from Vancouver to Calgary, which it was at a time called Terracin Pipelines. And we had a few different pipelines. Trans Mountain was one of them. We had Corridor, we had Express pipeline that goes down into mid-continent U.S., but sold both of those, kept Trans Mountain, renamed Trans Mountain when we became federally owned back in 2017. And I left, retired in 2022.
And for context, how much oil was the pipeline moving at that time and now?
We had a capacity of 300,000 barrels a day prior to this last expansion that took it up to 890,000 barrels a day. There was a small expansion that was done back in 2007-8 that took it from about 225, 230 up to the 300. We added some capacity, a little bit of looping through Jasper National Park, and that was really the first phase of the expansion. So when I started, it was 225. We took it up to 300 and then ultimately up to 890,000.
And you actually don't know this, but we've met before at the industry event. You polled the crowd for some answers and you called on me. So
good.
We have met before and we meet again. Good. So
yeah, well, good to see you again.
You probably don't know that, but Here we are.
Yeah.
So to go back in time, originally, I think you're from Winnipeg?
Yep. Originally from Winnipeg. Started the natural gas distribution business back in Winnipeg in the late 1970s with Northern Central Gas through to ICG, Westcoast Energy. And then we sold the gas utility in Manitoba to Manitoba Hydro in 1999. I stayed with what was then Westcoast Energy, moved to Victoria, spent a couple of years in Victoria, working under Westcoast Energy, then to British Columbia, or into Vancouver with BC Gas. And they're the ones that moved me out here for a 2-year stint that ended up being 17.
What attracted you to the midstream utilities and energy sector in the beginning? How'd you get into the business?
I started out very junior, as a phone clerk working on the, service line in Winnipeg, and just stayed with the industry. I got my accounting designation. I got highly involved in the regulatory work. The industry was evolving and changing back in the early 2000s as markets opened up. And I really enjoyed the regulatory work. And then I got more involved in community work and communities that utilities touch and midstream assets touch. And, kind of evolved my career from there.
So you're just looking for a good job, more or less, in your 20s?
I was looking for a good job, and I got one. And I stayed through, I think there were 9 different transactions. Where, I was with a company that was either bought or sold, but I had continuous service through 9 different companies in my all being, 40-year career.
How old were you when you started working?
Oh, I was early 20s, went to school for a bit, then went to accounting school, started with the gas company in my early 20s, and stayed through 9 different iterations of that.
I think it was Centra Gas originally?
It was originally Northern Central, then ICG, then Centra.
Okay.
So, yeah, there was lots of transactions that went on between ICG back in the day, and Westcoast Energy, and then BC Gas, who became Terrason, became Trans Mountain. I mean, the most material transaction that I was a part of was, the sale of Trans Mountain from Kinder Morgan to the federal government back in 2017.
So through your 20s, you were just thinking you have a good career in this area of the business?
Yeah, I went into accounting as a way to get a foothold into something, never wanting to be a lifelong accountant per se. But, as you learn a business and as you grow through business, you realize that if you don't know the numbers, it's really hard to run business. So I got to know how to understand the numbers and the commercial terms of the varying contracts and businesses I was in. And yeah, it just kind of, there was no magical path set out in front. It just kind of evolved over time.
No career goals to get into the sector specifically?
None whatsoever.
Kind of organically grew.
It was a job that organically grew. And, I don't think in those 40 years I ever applied for a job, which is, the first one, obviously, and maybe the first couple within the company I was in. But after that, it was more just promotion and movement and more responsibility as I went along. I had a goal at one point to be a vice president, be by 40, and I was a vice president at 38. So some of those, midterm objectives, but there was never a grand plan. It was just work hard and let the chips fall as they may.
Do you ever think about starting your own pipeline system or utility business or anything?
No, I didn't, and I haven't since. I liked who I worked for. I had a lot of great mentors and leaders. I worked for Otto Lang back in Manitoba. I worked for a fellow by the name of Gary Hoffman, who was influential. Mike Phelps at Westcoast Energy was a huge influence on me. John Reed at BC Gas. So I worked for a lot of great people, and I learned a lot from them, and they really helped shape my development in my career.
You could see the opportunity ahead of you. I mean, you didn't change jobs.
Yeah, they could see where they wanted to move me and what they wanted to do, and moving cities, moving jobs, moving responsibilities was all part of that plan, and I was fine with it and went along really well.
So you got to Westcoast Energy, which became Terrason, and then you ended up as the president?
Westcoast Energy was acquired by Duke Energy. At the same time, BC Gas was acquiring Centra Gas, British Columbia, which was on Vancouver Island. So I had a choice to make of stay with Westcoast and go within the Duke transaction or move over to BC Gas. And I chose to stay with BC Gas, moved to Vancouver for a couple of years with them. Then they rebranded to become Terrason. Then they sent me to Calgary in 2005, and I've been here ever since.
You became president what year?
2005.
Of Terrason.
Of Terrason Pipelines, yep. And then it became Kinder Morgan Canada.
Right.
I was president of Kinder Morgan Canada when Kinder Morgan acquired Terrason in late 2005.
So at that time, things were going really well.
Sorry?
Career was going really well.
Yeah, it was very good. I mean, when I came to Calgary, I didn't really know the oil business. I was a natural gas pipeline guy, and not as an engineer, but as an accountant. Didn't know the oil business, but had a couple of great people advised me when I hit Calgary of who you need to know. And it wasn't a big community to get to know. If you knew 5 or 6 key people, you kind of knew the business. So I met some of those people early on and worked with them over the years, most of them upstream suppliers, the likes of, the midstream guys like Al Quisley and Pat Daniels, obviously. I got to know them well. Mick at Pembina, I got to know some of the upstream folks, running, CNRL and Suncor and the like, and got to know the people and then got to know the business a little bit, and the rest is history.
You didn't mind the cold in Calgary?
No, I'm a Winnipeg guy. I was fine with the cold in Calgary.
Minus 30 didn't matter.
Didn't matter.
Especially at Victoria.
Yeah.
So you ended up as CEO of Kinder Morgan Canada, but maybe for the listener, what was Kinder Morgan Canada and who were Kinder and Morgan?
Yeah, interesting. So Rich Kinder left Enron. That's a well-documented story. Rich left, partnered up with his friend Mike Morgan. They simply formed Kinder Morgan. The name of the logo was done over dinner on a napkin. When Rich left Enron, he acquired a piece of pipe in Colorado, and then started growing that business really on the backs of natural gas distribution and transmission in the U.S. They got into CO2 flooding of well sites in West Texas. They formed a products division where they were moving commodities. They formed a terminals business that they were very great into. And then they looked north, and when they looked north, they saw Terracin. And Terracin at the time had the Trans Mountain system. It had the natural gas utility in British Columbia, Vancouver, and Lower Mainland, as well as a small water and utility business. And Rich really wanted to acquire what he saw as the defining straw into the oil sands, as he called it. So he bought Terracin, kept Trans Mountain, sold off the rest, sold the gas utility to Fortis. The water business went private. He kept Trans Mountain, and we immediately went into expansion discussions of what that would look like. Kinder Morgan prided themselves on being a different kind of company. They were very frugal with their capital. They were very attentive to capital allocation, where they're putting it, and project economics and project execution. So we started on this road of expansion of Trans Mountain right away, and we got the first piece done in 2007 through Jasper. And then we went on to test the market for the major expansion. We anticipated in 2007 and 2008 we'd do it in phases, but the market responded in spades and really supported the full build-out of the looping of Trans Mountain, taking it right up to 890,000 barrels a day. So we started on that venture. And, it got to the point in 2015-16 when we were starting to execute the project. We had our federal approvals, as difficult as those were to come by. The line of sight to completion of the project became a bit vague and a bit opaque. And we had opposition, as I'm sure we'll talk about, in British Columbia and in Burnaby and in some communities. I never lost confidence in the project, but an investor, essentially, Kinder Morgan did, and that led to the transaction with the federal government.
So Kinder Morgan spotted some good assets coming out of Enron, and their value proposition was that they would optimize those assets?
That's right. They optimized them. They grew them. They expanded them incrementally over time and grew to be, one of the largest energy companies in the U.S. over a decade or so. Very disciplined, very focused on cash, very focused on project execution. Rich left, a few years back, and it's been run by, likes of Park Shaper and Steve Kane and Kim Dang now. Great people that I worked with for a long time, but very business-minded and very astute. And as I said, the Trans Mountain project got to the point where it was just not within their risk wheelhouse.
It's a relatively small industry, even within North America, but how did those guys know to look north to Canada to Trans Mountain?
I don't know, really. I mean, back in the day, I think they always had a lens on North America. They were U.S.-centric for sure. I think it was a matter of reading and hearing about kind of the opportunity the oil sands presented for growth and expansion. The maturity of the players up there, the capital that was flowing, because back at that time, there was lots of capital flowing into the oil sands. There was lots of players, international players. I mean, that's all changed now, but back in the day, in the mid-2000s, there was lots of offshore investment and growth in the oil sands that they wanted to tap into.
So they could see it even from down south.
Yeah.
And
it wasn't just for Trans Mountain. I mean, they got into the terminal business up here, expanded, merchant terminal operations in Edmonton, acquired Vancouver Wharves on the coast where they were moving commodities, sulfur and mineral concentrates out of Vancouver Harbor. So they expanded the footprint of what was Terracin into something that was more akin to what they ran in the States.
So how were they able to get into the market? Did they just pay up? Because it's not like other people didn't recognize the value of that asset. How were they able to get it so easily? Or how'd they get there?
Trans Mountain or
Trans Mountain?
I think they had a value proposition. Because Terracin wasn't on the market. It wasn't like it was a process. They came in, and that's the way they work. They like to be sole acquirers. They don't like the competition and the bidding process. So they would have paid for that exclusive right to negotiate. They made big commitments around people and keeping people, etc. I ran the operation here. We changed some of our platforms and systems, but other than that, Canada was left alone to run itself and report in as a business unit to Rich and his board. So I think they likely paid up for the rights to have an exclusive negotiation with Terrason, and it happened very, very quickly. I mean, I first was brought into a meeting and told about it in March of 2005, and it was closed by later that summer. Like, it happened very quickly.
In a strong market, they could get the equity they needed to purchase the asset relatively quick.
He had a strong balance sheet, Kinder always has a strong balance sheet, so they were able to get the capital easily.
And to go back, way back, the pipeline itself was built in the 50s.
1953.
So who built the pipeline?
Who built the pipeline? The entity that built the pipeline, it was Trans Mountain Pipeline.
I think it was like Standard Oil or something.
It might have been.
Okay.
I mean, I don't think I've read the history that closely enough. I mean, it was an act of parliament that approved that pipeline. Mm-hmm. It was post-war. Energy supply security on the west coast of North America was topical and was highly sensitive. How does, the U.S. and Canada on the west coast maintain their access to crude for energy security purposes? And so it was an act of parliament in 1951. It was completed in 2 years for $93 million. So it was a feat. The construction Trans Mountain was built during a time when there was no Coquihalla Highway. There was no roads and highways through that route. It was a treacherous build and accomplished very quickly. And it was a very proud moment for Canada. We talk about rail and highway and all these national building projects. Well, Trans Mountain in its day was as well. And it took crude to refineries on the west coast of North America, California and British Columbia, at a time when energy security was top of mind.
Security. The point is you need your energy for security purposes.
You need your feedstock of oil in order to produce the gasolines and diesels you need to run as an economy. And you don't want to be beholden to, foreign players for that. And so, bringing on board the then just starting and growing Western Canadian sedimentary basin to the west coast of Canada and North America was a very strategic move.
And even then, with 1950s technology, it only took 2 years.
Only took 2 years. And, that pipe is as good today as it was when I went in. Mm-hmm. We maintained it, and the coating on it was high quality. It is, as an asset, performed incredibly well.
And at the time, how much oil would it have been moving then?
It would have been moving about 450,000 barrels a day. And then it shrunk when Alaska crude came on board. So when Alaska crude started up in the 60s, 70s, that oil, again, it was U.S. produced, so it had to go into U.S. markets. They didn't have export capability. So Alaska crude displaced a lot of the Canadian crude into California and Washington State refineries. So Trans Mountain dropped to moving only maybe 125, 150,000 barrels a day. Pump stations were taken out of commission. It was really sized down when Alaska crude came on. As Alaskan crude started to mature, and as the Western Canada sedimentary basin started to mature, and as demand started to increase on the West Coast, it gradually grew up to where it is today.
And as of today, it's about 90% of the supply of refined and unrefined products to BC.
Oh, yeah.
Gas
Yeah.
tanks.
Yeah.
So,
You've got some refined products that comes up on barge from Washington State. So it goes into a refinery in Washington State. It produces gasoline and diesel, comes on barge. So barges will serve some of the islands, around the South Coast. And it's there as jet fuel, comes up on barges to the lower mainland from Washington State, but roughly 90% of the gasoline and diesel consumed in the lower mainland comes off of Trans Mountain.
And so you're at Kinder Morgan from 2005 until 2018 when the pipeline got spun out. Do you remember that time frame when you were thinking about where the pipeline was going to go?
Well, we were into construction on the expansion. We were about $1 billion in. Rich and his team concluded that while we were starting construction, they didn't see how we were going to finish construction, and this thing was just going to be
This is the expansion.
Expansion wandering along, and they were just going to leave and wrap up the project, continue to hold the asset, but not pursue the project anymore. And I worked really hard to convince them that this was an asset and an expansion that needed to be done for this country, and I believed that we could do it. We could get over the politics, we could get over the regulatory and legal hurdles. So we went to market, back in 2017, and we talked to everybody. We talked to strategics, we talked to private equity, we talked to offshore, we talked to pension funds. We talked to Alberta, we talked to British Columbia. We ended up in Ottawa, talking to Minister Morneau at the time, and convinced him that this was a project and an asset that had to be optimized for the national interest. And he saw that in the importance of the expansion. And like I say, selling Trans Mountain from Kinder Morgan to the federal government was the best of a bunch of bad alternatives. I mean, Kinder was leaving. It was the defining, we talk about the lack of investor confidence and the lack of capital due to investor confidence. I mean, I lived through that. I had an investor who said, I'm $1 billion in, I'm not spending anymore, we're done. We salvaged it by selling it quickly to the federal government. And I applaud Bill, and Paul Rochon, who was his deputy at the time, in seeing the importance of the asset and their acquisition of it. But it was a very tense time. And right at that sale time, of course, we lost our federal certificate from the regulator to proceed. It was overturned as a result of lack of consultation by the Crown and lack of some of the marine study work that they determined needed to be done. So we sold to the federal government, and the same day we lost our certificate to build the project. So that was a very, probably the toughest, days and weeks of my career, was how to, A, now deal with a new owner, being the federal government, and C, get our certificate back so we could continue building what they bought. So it was a tough time.
Do you think if the expansion project hadn't been proposed and tried, Kinder Morgan would have kept the pipeline as a nice little,
for sure,
toll?
Rich was going to keep the pipe just as a 300,000 barrel a day, performing very well, fully nominated every month, making a nice return. He would have kept it, but for the expansion and the belief we had that expansion had to get done, and Kinder wasn't going to do it, so somebody else had to do it.
But the idea was you expand the project, it helps national security, but you could also make more revenue as a result of more oil. You could have just stayed as this pipeline was, though. Did that ever cross your mind at the time? Like, you don't have to do this?
And, I didn't want to go backwards. I wanted to keep going forwards. We had the overwhelming support of our producers and Alberta. The producing community wanted to get oil to Tidewater. They had signed long-term commitments to do so at tolls that we were very satisfied with, and returns that justified the expenditures as we estimated at the time. And it became bigger than just Trans Mountain and the existing piece of pipe. I mean, it became something that we believed, and I believed in my heart, that the nation needed, that the producers in Alberta needed, that the Alberta government needed, that the worker confidence within the sector needed. And so I was determined to pursue it. If Kinder had come along and said, we're not going to sell it, we're just going to wrap up the project and continue operating this nice little piece of pipe, I'm not sure I would have stayed, because I'd worked so long on the expansion and everything about it that I was really determined to stick with it, and we found a solution to get it done.
How come do you think Kinder Morgan decided to leave altogether and not just keep the project just as the pipeline as it was? How come they decided to just get out of Canada altogether?
They were losing confidence in some of the regulatory, legal, and political churning that was occurring in Canada at the time. They were seeing it being more and more difficult. They had some terminal projects that they were building as well up in Edmonton and in Vancouver that were going through some of the same challenges, both from a local support, Indigenous inclusion, regulatory approvals, that whole space within Canada. And that's what we look at now and refer to the lost decade. They were kind of in it then. And so they saw all of that. So their appeal for this straw out of the oil sands diminished over time.
I see.
It was at its peak when the expansion looked like it was going to go, and we had all this commercial support, and we had producers around the world signing contracts with us to fill the pipe. But once we hit, some of that spin cycle of regulatory and legal and political churn, they lost their interest quickly. I didn't lose my interest. I still believed always that we could execute it, but it was so several factors were involved in their departure from Canada.
So the reason for the expansion project was that there was more oil coming down from the oil sands. But maybe for the listener, what was the Trans Mountain expansion project, and why did you decide to do it? Yeah,
so the first phase that I talked about back in 2007, we twinned the pipeline through Jasper National Park and Mount Robson Provincial Park. That took us from 225 up to 300,000 barrels a day. And by permit, the approval we had to go through the park in the first place allowed us to go back in once to upgrade it. So we went in once and upgraded it and twinned the line. Then we continued talking to the market, continued talking to producers. They were very keen on going to the West Coast. Northern Gateway was being contemplated at the same time. Then attention kind of turned to the Gulf Coast, which ultimately led to Keystone being built and Enbridge upgrading some of their system in the U.S. to get more Canadian barrels to the Gulf Coast. Then it came back to the West Coast, and we, worked commercially, always believing that the expansion of an existing pipeline was easier than the building of a new one. Brownfield is going to be easier than greenfield. So we had that benefit, and we continued to pursue it. Northern Gateway went through its own, difficulties and ended up being canceled. We continued on, and the market supported the full expansion. So we proceeded with designing a 800,000 barrel a day full twinning completing the twinning of the pipeline, basically 75% of it in existing right of way, but touching Indigenous communities and municipalities and cities, unlike we did during the original construction. In 1953, when the original pipe went in, those communities didn't exist the way they did today. The Fraser Valley was just farmland that you just plowed the pipe through. Well, building today is was much more difficult, but we got all the approvals necessary, and we went ahead.
So the idea was you put the second line in the same right of way as the first,
as much as possible. As much as possible. For environmental reasons, in some places you had to move. Water courses had changed, streams and rivers change, environmental sensitivities in some areas evolved over 50 years. So that had us routing differently, or urban population in and around the pipeline grew to such a point that it made sense to take the route elsewhere. So we wanted to stay in existing as much as we could because it was already disturbed and we knew the land, and we were able to accomplish that for about 75% of the way. The other 25%, we veered off existing right away into new terrain because it made sense to.
But the point was that this dueling of the line helped environmental concerns. Nobody likes to impact the environment, even.
That's right. So we wanted to minimize environmental impacts right from the very beginning. Do as much, trenching under roads and rail and rivers and streams as we could. Disturb as little of the community as we could. Protect, the plants and animals as much as we could. And a large part of that was built off of local Indigenous involvement, where they helped us understand better the land and who occupies the land and what the plants and animals are on the land and how they behave And so that informed our work in a very meaningful way. They also, made sure we were well aware of where there were sensitive sites or sacred sites or traditional hunting or gathering lands that we were perhaps going to go on, so that we could design and engineer the project and its routing to minimize those impacts.
And as a result, the oil that was flowing through the pipe would increase to, what was the
890.
And for context, how much revenue is that as a business on its own? What kind of numbers are we talking?
Top line, well, our EBITDA, so earnings before interest and taxes, grew pre-construction to post-construction from neighborhood of $250, $300 million a year to something closer to 12 to 15 billion
in revenues,
in earnings before taxes.
So
it grew
a lot of money.
Materially.
But the problem was that original cost and the capital you had to spend ballooned from the beginning to the end. So
the lesson learned there, Trevor, would have been, we never should have tried to forecast how much it was going to cost too early. So we do, you look at maps and you look at routes and you tabletop estimate and you look at other projects and you translate their cost into this cost, and you take your estimates of what your engagement work and consultation work is going to cost. And, the very first estimates were $5-6 billion, quickly went to 8 to 10 once we got going. And then, the things we encountered along the way were game changers, floods of the century, COVID, heat domes, fires, competing for labor, CGL, Site C, and Trans Mountain were all working at the same time. So there's competition for labor and quality of worker. We lost our permit. We had to redo it again. The amount we spent on Indigenous inclusion and opportunity that I would spend again every day. That's how much I believe in it. But all of those costs were unestimatable in the early days. And, it ended up, costing, north of 30 billion at the end of the day. But, it took, 12, 13 years to do it. And every day you're spending money and your financing costs are accruing. So it became a project that I would never refer to the cost as being out of hand, but the predictability of the costs became less and less certain and less possible as the whole scope of the project evolved into something that had, my security costs, for example, originally budgeted at $40-50 million. Well, I spent 10 times that on security. I spent $400-500 million on security. For crews and sites and protection of the assets, etc. Never would have imagined that. The productivity of the field work wasn't what we expected it to be. The geology we encountered, building in an urban setting in the heart of Vancouver, tunneling under Burnaby Mountain versus just building through the streets, again, was a big give to the community. We took all the pipe out of their backyards and their streets and put it in a tunnel through the mountain. Well, that was north of $100 million. So everything you did was kind of in $100 million increments, and it added up over time. But we end with a project that we can very confidently say is the best pipeline, globally in terms of its environmental responsibility, the mode of construction, the safety mechanisms we put around it. We put fiber, a Calgary firm developed fiber along the whole line, and it's state-of-the-art technology to be able to detect any leaks or disturbances in and around a pipeline. If somebody's traveling on a right-of-way in a truck, we're going to know because the vibration of the ground is picked up by the fiber. So we've got the best pipeline we've possibly built.
When you originally planned the project and you were doing the investor returns on it, what was the expected return you thought at the original budget with kind of double digits
Yeah,
annualized
it would have
returns?
been, early to mid-teen kind of returns,
Hmm.
with upside above that if we filled all of our uncommitted space. And I'm not sure what the numbers are now. I mean, I'm not there, but I imagine they're somewhat less than that. And again, they're going through a whole toll proceeding with their shippers to determine what the right toll is as a result of the completion of the project. But so that is probably a story to be concluded another day on what the actual is. But it's not going to be what we envision it to be.
But the returns are excellent if and when or the project had come on time, been built on time, it would have been in great returns. That's the whole point.
Sure. That's why you do it, right?
Yeah.
That's why investor capital is there.
Yeah.
And that's the very investor capital that left.
Mm.
So, the only party, if I look back on it, that can economically justify the expansion as it was undertaken is somebody like the federal government, because they also have the tax benefits. They got the job benefits. There's the royalty benefits that they can take credit for because they actually, come to them and they affect GDP and they affect, the revenues of governments, both Alberta and Canada. So the number of positive economic impacts that they can look at are much greater than just the pure investor that's looking for the return on capital.
Yeah. Speaking of benefits, TMX was expected to add approximately $9 billion in GDP and $2.8 billion in tax revenues between 2024 and 2043, as well as increasing the prices Canadian energy producers get for their oil, narrowing the differentials between Canadian benchmarks and North American benchmarks, and tens of thousands of good middle-class jobs during construction. So
Yeah.
that's a good way to summarize it.
It definitely is, and I expect those numbers are being exceeded now. I expect there likely is more positive impact. Those who have been on the conservative side. But I know that, the federal government enabled Trans Mountain to access capital at a very good rate, right? And all of that debt sits on the balance sheet of Trans Mountain. All of it will be refinanced and repaid. And it's not that taxpayers are funding, Trans Mountain. That we were able to borrow at attractive rates as a result of being federally owned. And now we're going through processes there to refinance it and repay it. And those dividends are going back to Canada and the government quarterly now. And someday they'll transact, and I think that a transaction is likely optimal once they resolve their toll, disagreement with the shippers. They get up to full production, and they start to advance some of the optimization projects they're looking at to increase capacity even more. So it's going to be an attractive asset to be sold.
But the reason it had to be sold to the government was, among other things, environmental concerns, which nobody likes to impact the environment. I'm a big skier. I go hiking every weekend. And so what were the environmental concerns or what were the problems that held it up?
So if we put those pieces together and unpack that a little bit, there were environmental sensitivities around the expansion of the project, both in terms of the location, the lands that we were on, the streams and rivers that we're crossing, 1,100 stream and river crossings. So there's lots of watercourse crossings. And, all of the regulations around ensuring that is done safely, responsibly, and in a way to reduce the risk of environmental impact adds cost to a project. You've got to build it differently. You've got to design it differently. You got to take different measures. We were having to move endangered species of snails that are present in the Fraser Valley, or garter snake pits. We would take garter snakes out of their den, move them, and then put them back again. A huge biological project, archaeological project, and in archaeological testing up and down the Rhine, just shovel testing locations thousands of times to ensure there's no artifacts or historical occurrences that we need to be conscious of. So all of those things add cost to the project, and we took them very responsibly and very, very openly to do everything we can to reduce the environmental impact of the work that we did.
Within reason.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you always have a balance, right? There's always a balance between what you can do. Taking the project out of the streets of Burnaby and putting it in a tunnel through a solid rock mountain reduces the environmental effect or risk on that community through which the line goes. We changed our construction techniques through the Jacko Lake region just south of Kamloops because there was concerns about historical indigenous sites that we could disrupt if we just open trenched and built. So we microtunneled. We brought in special equipment from Europe that we would build pits and then microtunnel to another location and then progressively go through that plateau in a way to eliminate the risk of any disturbance that we might encounter. So countless things were done. I think we originally projected to do 40 or 50 trenchless crossings, and we ended up doing hundreds and hundreds of them. Again, local concerns, indigenous concerns, community concerns, environmentalist concerns over the protection of salmon habitat and fishing habitat led us to trench under more streams and rivers by a wide margin than what we originally envisioned. Underneath the Trans-Canada Highway, as we come out of the Coquihalla into the Fraser Valley, we were trenching underneath that highway numerous times rather than open cutting and disturbing traffic and the like. So we took all those measures very seriously. We had 153 conditions we had to meet. We invested heavily in marine response, capabilities and understanding the impact of tanker traffic on, the southern resident killer whales or other, fish populations. So we did lots of work on that, again, to minimize the impacts.
The point is that environmental concerns and other things like that aren't unimportant, but it's the cost and benefits of the project, which just happened to coincide with the lost decade starting in roughly 2050. Do you think if the expansion project had been proposed at a different era, it would have got done quicker or built?
For sure it would have. The political environment in Canada was not helpful for a successful project. And when I say that, I mean, I went through lots of different administrations and different controlling parties between Alberta, BC, and Canada. Went through NDP governments, Liberal governments, and PC governments in all three places. And one of the most significant hurdles that we continued to face was the alignment of national, provincial, and local interests. That you had Burnaby that didn't want the project. I had communities along the way that were unsure of whether they supported the project because of the impacts. I had provincial governments in BC not supporting the project. I had a federal government fully supportive and then not so much, and then maybe kind of supportive. So this dynamic of political alignment around what's important was so much different during that decade, I think, than what we're seeing today. Hopefully what we're seeing today is that alignment, because that alignment makes for more efficient decision-making, quicker regulatory resolution, more investor certainty to attract the capital, more project execution certainty. And that's what I didn't have during that decade. So I fought through it. I dealt with John Horgan, bless him, and I dealt with Derek Horgan in Burnaby, and I dealt with Rachel here in Alberta, and she became a good ally and friend. Dealt with Jerry Butts working in the Prime Minister's office in Ottawa. So we had to navigate all of that, and I always believed we could get there, and we did, but it took a long time. And it caused delay. It caused court cases to be heard. It had permits withheld. I needed 4,400 permits from the province of British Columbia. 4,400. So every road crossing, every access point, every electrical permit, building permit, etc., all had to go through British Columbia. And they weren't wired for a project of that scale with its urban touch, with its environmental sensitivity. and they weren't motivated to wire themselves to respond, because they had a government that was kind of not really supporting it. So that filters into the bureaucracy, and the bureaucracy says, well, why do I want to work so hard supporting this project that my government doesn't even support or my minister doesn't support? So we had to navigate through that, and all of that, jurisdictional bodies and statutory authorities are going to do their job, but the efficiency at which they do it can vary depending upon some of the politics involved, and that's what we faced for that decade.
The opponents of the project have, like it or not, done a good job of messaging on why the project shouldn't get built or the reasons they believe it shouldn't get built. Do you think there was room for improvement looking back on the messaging from the builders to communicate the benefits of the project like schools built?
What I would say is we faced a good measure of opposition. We faced a good measure of protest activity. But we also worked very hard at understanding the concerns and issues of those messages. In other words, I spent time meeting with environmental groups. I spent time in hotel rooms privately meeting with the leaders of some of our most active opposition, not to try and convince them that they were wrong and I was right, but to get as much understanding around what their point was and why they were so actively opposing, and learn from that. So what that led to was more investment in marine response capability, more investment in salmon habitat restoration, more diversity of route in order to avoid certain areas. So we did things that I can look back and say, we learned from the environmental movements that opposed the project. And we responded, always looking at, the benefit and the cost, and making sure that this was something that we could economically justify doing. But it broke down some of those barriers. When some of those groups saw what we were doing, it took some of the wind out of their sails. But it accomplished what they sought to accomplish, which was a better, more responsible project. And projects today, I think, need to do that. Is you don't just look at opposition and try and change its mind through messaging. Look to understand where it's coming from. One of the best examples I can give are when we had, in 2010, we were doing some geological hole testing in Burnaby Mountain to understand the geology of the mountain, to see how solid it was or not, how much water column existed within the mountain, how granular were some of the areas, perhaps, to ascertain whether or not a tunnel was feasible. Yeah. So we were doing these test holes on the top of Burnaby Mountain that attracted, observers and ultimately opposition. There was protests up there for a couple of weeks, and we got some test holes done, not as many as we wanted, but I went up there incognito, if you like, to just get a feel for what this opposition and this protest activity was really about. And I found that it ranged from everywhere from a extreme eco activist to a mother with her child in a baby carriage, just concerned about the trees or or her neighborhood, or just curious, and everything in between. That opposition was not singular, and it didn't present itself the same way. And so we learned, I think, through time to understand it a little bit more sophisticatedly than others, and that enabled us to respond better, I think, to do things to directly offset some of that opposition.
In other words, we take the environmental concerns seriously, but also here are some of the benefits, like schools for your kids and hospitals and roads.
That's right. We'll leave your community better than we found it, through investment in your community, through jobs that we hired local. It was local first, Indigenous first, regional second, national third. So we looked to hire local businesses, local contractors. Obviously, we invested a significant amount in Indigenous business all along the pipeline. But that was the objective, is that I'm going to build this long linear piece of infrastructure that once I'm done, you're never going to know it's there again. but we're going to leave a benefit and legacy in your community.
I think the problem is that pipelines are visible when they're being built, but taxes and royalties are intangible in the benefits they produce. Do you
Right.
think
They get
that
meshed together with the rest of society, and you don't see the incremental impacts, which is why reports like the one you quoted that draw a finer light on what the benefits are important for society to understand.
Did you realize that along the way? Did it take?
We learned it along the way. We learned, I tell you what we learned, Trevor. We learned that waiving national numbers of billions of GDP and don't cut it. People just kind of gloss over because they don't see what that means. So we started to translate it more into local impacts. Here's what your local economy is going to see in terms of what we pay in property taxes is going to triple. So we're going to go from X to Y in the property tax that we're paying in your community. We're going to invest in these parks or these roadways or these green spaces to make your community better. We're going to hire this many local people in your community. We're going to leave your hotel rooms full at the time when they might not otherwise be full. So we tried to get more granular with the economic impact to be something people could relate to.
Could see.
Yeah.
Do you think that the invasion of Ukraine kind of started to change the tide on the realization that energy was important to society?
I think that, along with ongoing Middle Eastern tensions and along with...
when do you think it started to change?
Oh, geez. I left in 22. I left Trans Mountain at 22 and didn't leave everything. But I think, in early 2020s, so 2021, 22, we started to see a bit of an evolution around energy security. And now I think we're at a point where that misalignment I talked about before is starting to get aligned.
You could see it changing a bit?
You can see it changing, yeah. I mean, we still have a lot of work to do. We still have, a decade of perhaps some missteps in terms of actually achieving all that we have the potential to achieve. But I'm optimistic that we're on the right path. It will require a bit of patience. It will require a bit of reduction of political, rhetoric and focus on what's achievable and what's aligned, between provinces and the feds. But I think we're on a path, hopefully, to success.
One of the value props is that you can get your energy, which is a requirement for life in Canada, and it's produced ethically, not from corrupt regimes in, say, Russia, where they kill people and invade other countries.
Right.
Does it take a while to get that message out?
I think it's table stakes now. I mean, that is a message that everybody can share and believe in.
That would seem like
and understand.
Sense.
It's just common sense now. And I think that people can and should embrace that, and look at the Canadian barrel to be shared globally and to be, as I put it, the last barrel sold. The last barrel sold should be a Canadian barrel because it's so ethically produced. It is responsibly produced. It produced in such a way that's using the best technologies to reduce environmental footprint, et cetera, et cetera. We should be proud of that Canadian barrel. And the global consume barrels for decades to come. Let's position the Canadian barrel to be the last barrel sold.
That's nowadays, but at the time, you had to deal with unprecedented levels of scrutiny. How did you do that? And what lessons or what principles did you apply to that situation?
Back when we were trying to build and I had a term that I used very, very often. And that was, we will always stake out and maintain the high road. So that high road principle, it transcended itself into everything we did. So if we're in a community, we'd be on the high road. If we were in a media frenzied debate, we would stay on the high road. We wouldn't ever devolve ourselves into petty, claims and assertions. We would stick to the high road, stick to our principles, do our negotiating and discussions in rooms, not in public. We would respect other people's points of view. We preached that a lot, which was just because somebody doesn't agree with you doesn't mean they're wrong and you're right. you may be wrong, they may be right, or right may be somewhere in between. And let's not get so fixated and stubborn in our own point of view that we don't listen to others. We have to listen to others because we don't know everything. And particularly when the things we're talking about are local and local impacts, we need to be humble enough to listen and learn and adjust. And don't be stubborn to just, as I used to say, decide, advocate, and defend. We have to be prepared to change our mind if that's what makes sense. One of the lessons I learned on that front was cold water. So Coldwater Indian Band is just south of Merritt. And we had a long dispute with Coldwater around routing. The existing pipe goes right through their reserve, right through their schoolyard. We had varying routes contemplated to go in and around the reserve in Coldwater, and they were afraid of their aquifer and us affecting their aquifer, which was the lifeblood of their community. And they wanted us to cross the river and go around their whole community in a totally different route and cross the Coldwater River twice to get back. And I resisted that for months and months and years. I thought, no, we can convince them that the route we are selecting is the best route, both for us economically, and it's going to be no harm to them. It's going to be on the reserve. They're going to collect taxes more than they would have otherwise, et cetera, et cetera. Eventually, I changed my mind, and we built around the reserve. And the lesson there was I should have done that far sooner. I should have made that call earlier to heed the counsel and advice I was getting from the chief and change the route. We eventually did, but I think, proponents have to be open-minded to other points of view, and that's what we tried to do along that path.
The level of scrutiny was high at the time, but you dealt with it in a measured approach. However, were there any examples of when things got out of hand, just to give the listener perspective of what you had to deal with?
Things got out of hand. So the best example I can recall is a little community of Blue River in the North Thompson, north of Kamloops, and the pipeline goes right through the community and coming down the North Thompson. And we were very actively involved with the community around setting up a camp there for our workers. The economic impact of Blue River was significant. The legacy we're going to leave was significant. And along the way, fairly activist-oriented opposition, Canada's Manual, decided to start this Tiny House Warriors campaign where they built these little houses and they transported them up to Blue River and put them on Crown land and basically occupied the site. And from time to time, there'd be upwards of, a couple dozen people. In the harsher climates of winter, there would only be, a few people staying in these little houses that had, propane heaters. And they were there to stand in opposition to our work through that area. But they significantly disrupted the whole community. They weren't welcomed by the community. But we had to I use the word deal with them. We had to, manage that relationship for years because they stayed there. We were determined to continue our work, to build through the area, to put a camp there. And that camp was exposed to vandalism and stone throwing and name calling and yelling and screaming. And, when you go to work every day and you're confronted with that, it's mentally difficult. So security, was on high alert in the area. But it was one of those situations that we worked with the local Indigenous community to make sure they were working with us. They provided all security. They were in opposition to these, folks that were there from afar, staking out the ground for their own purpose. But it was a tense location and time that was very personally, questionable in terms of safety and the workers. But we got through it, and the community, really came to our side in helping us with that. But that's an example of one of the more difficult situations we faced.
Did you
I
ever
mean,
have to worry?
COVID was difficult. COVID was difficult, obviously.
Did you ever have to worry? Were you ever worried about your own safety?
That's a great question. And I was never personally worried, but those security people around me convinced me I should be, so I would travel and I wouldn't want security. I would like to just get in the car and go somewhere and go meet, but I would travel with security. And the most, I think, sensitive period of time when we were highly prominent in protest activity in and around Vancouver and the like. Northern Gateway was. I was in Vancouver 60 to 80 nights a year, meeting with businesses, meeting with labor, meeting with Indigenous leaders, meeting with politicians, meeting with mayors and councillors and the like. And I had in my briefcase a brief that had photos of about 30 people that I should always be like on the lookout for, because you never know how they might behave if they see you walking from a hotel to a restaurant. So I didn't walk from hotels to restaurants. I had cars take me, which I never liked. It wasn't who I was, but I never had, we had one spell where we had, a whole influx of phone calls and emails into the house, that disrupted home life a little bit, but there was no damage ever done. There was no vandalism that ever occurred. And I was never confronted with anything that would have caused any harm, but we were careful.
Do you ever think to yourself, this isn't worth it? I'm not getting paid enough?
No, never thought that. Not for a second. I believed in what we were doing and how we were doing it. I believed in the measures I put around me to protect. No, never felt that for a second.
And speaking of afar, there are unconfirmed reports of, at times, foreign languages like Russian being around the work camps in the States and in Canada. Do you ever think that maybe something else is going on in some of these work sites? It's all unconfirmed, but you never know.
The closest we ever got to that, I never thought about or saw any kind of geopolitical elements, in our risk assessments. The closest we ever got were some of the assertions we picked up that, you'd get high-profile Hollywood actors supporting some of the activists and helping fund their activity, for their own interest. But that was the closest. I never saw or felt any. We had some extreme Greenpeace activity at some places where they would occupy themselves in trees and stuff along the right of way. But never from a geopolitical sense. Never saw any of that.
That story came from a reliable source in the States, from a sizable producer, but luckily we didn't.
We never saw any of it.
Looking back on things, do you believe we've gotten to the point in Canada where we're getting towards a regulatory and political environment necessary to build?
I really hope so. I hope that the geopolitical realities, the supply security realities, the Trump administration's behaviors has woken us up to the potential that we have, which is to harvest our natural resources that the globe wants to buy. Whether that's minerals and concentrates or potash or uranium or oil or natural gas, whatever it is. We're a nation of large geography and fairly modest population, and hopefully we've opened our eyes to the things we need to do better in order to attract the capital to trade with the world in a way that is done responsibly, ethically, for economic benefit of all people, for advancement of Indigenous reconciliation, for the protection of the environment, to help fuel the next generations of energy, that are going to be less, fossil intensive, to help fuel the technologies to capture carbon, to sequester it, you can't do those things if you're not a rich, affluent, economically strong nation. So let's be that, so we can be even more. and export that, technology down the road. So I think I really, really hope that we're getting more and more aligned. I think the public and the general, man and woman on the street are getting more aligned that way. And I just cross my fingers that the politics don't mess it up, because we do have politicians of different stripes across the country with different agendas who are voted in locally. I hope everybody can continue to see the benefit of being aligned. People will get impatient around pace. They'll look for change more quickly. Projects get started faster. I think we all need to be pragmatic about, what some of this will take, and some of the solutions we have to have along the way. But I'm an optimist. I was an optimist that we could build Trans Mountain, and we built it. I'm an optimist that we can change the course of, it's not just infrastructure development, it's enabling trade. It's responding to supply and demand. And if we got the supply and the demand exists, how do we solve for it? And some of that requires infrastructure. Some of it requires, trade obstacles to be removed and trade deals to be settled and tariffs to be solved. And, there's other things that will affect trade, but infrastructure will become a part of that. And I think that we have to set our political biases aside and look for what's best for the nation and our people. And I'm optimistic.
Energy abundance, which plainly spoken might be called cheap gas prices, is correlated to economic prosperity, which is correlated to human prosperity, is one way to put it.
100%. And that human prosperity and that societal prosperity is where you can generate the innovation, where you can generate the technological change, where you can generate the transformative aspects of what's going to continue to evolve us. And we want to be prosperous to do that.
And so how do you get that message across, looking back on things, now that you've had so much experience doing it?
I think it's continue to talk about it in ways like this. I mean, I don't go to a lot of conferences, but I've been to a few over the last couple of years. And the tone and the context of the conversation is very much more that. And it's very much more, let's seize opportunity here. Let's transform the trajectory that we're on, that we've been on for the last decade, and reorient it. So I think it's happening. The key trigger will be when it has happened enough, the confidence has built enough that investor capital starts to flow again. And we get meaningful new, investment in whether it's infrastructure or production. I think some of that capital sitting on the sidelines or going elsewhere. And when that starts to flow back, then I think we'll realize that we've turned a corner.
The environment is important, though, like we've said.
Yep.
What safeguards do you suggest for that area of life going forward? Because the motivation to make a profit will always be there, but you do want to protect the environment. Look,
you do.
How do you do that?
The thing I like to rely upon most is what did we learn from past experience and how do we do that better? And I think we can look at Trans Mountain and say, okay, we did it really, really well. We built an asset that respected the environment and responded to local concerns and interests, unlike any before it. But it took far too long and cost far too much. So how do we take some of that additional process and inefficient regulation and make that so the result is the same at lower cost and shorter time? And let's look at the processes that we went through. You can look at, the work they're doing up in the oil sands in order to conserve water or to explore different technologies to reduce emissions, to look at carbon capture, to, think about overall environmental footprints and taking some of the carbon out of the barrel. I think we're making progress there. We just need to stay on it and continue to advocate for Canadian resource development in a responsible way. Because I'm on the Board of Resourceworks, for example, a BC organization that is apolitical and it's designed to inform the public around how natural resource development in Canada is done and should continue to be done in an environmentally responsible way. and if our corporations and our politicians around the industry can keep talking about it and demonstrating it, we'll make progress.
One way that has made sense to me is to think in probabilities, where good probabilities will build a pipeline, make lots of money, create lots of jobs, and help society. There are small risks that come with that.
Mm-hmm.
If you were to present the problem that way, how do you reduce the probability of mistakes happening? What goes into that?
Right.
Better
What are
technology?
the safeguards you got in place? What are the technologies you put in place? The fiber we decided to put up and down Trans Mountain, that was voluntary. We weren't forced to do that. We did it as an additional safeguard to ensure that the environment around the pipe is protected and safeguarded. You know, our construction techniques, our marine response capabilities were all there to reduce that probability of mistakes and malfunctions. And industry, I think, is prepared to do that. I don't think there's anybody in the industry that I know anymore that's looking to cut corners on environmental stewardship and protection. That ship has sailed, so to speak. And I think industry gets that. So let's respect that industry gets it, align the regulations so that they're not adding additional burden.
What would be an example of that for the listener? The fact that you can hear vibrations along the line when the truck's driving across it. What are companies doing to mitigate those concerns?
So, inspection technologies, construction technologies, welding practices, the work they're doing in the oil sands to recycle water and keep water clean, the work they're doing to clean up, tailings ponds and their impact on the environment around. You look at some of the oil sand sites that have been reclaimed, they're pristine, back to the way they were before, the mining operation was ever there. So I think we can point to things that we're doing and that we have done. If we can get some of this carbon capture technology off the ground, I think that would be a huge demonstration of industry commitment to cleaning up what's going into the atmosphere. I think there's all kinds of examples that we can point to of how industry has responded, and proponents are often shy to do that. That's not their business.
Right.
And I think that's where associations can help. That's where associations like CAP and others can help lay out for public consumption all the things that are being done while continuing to develop the resource.
Doing podcasts.
Exactly right. Exactly right.
And on the positive side of those odds, like we said, the revenues are in the billions, which generate taxes and royalties. If you were to ballpark the revenues that generate or how much tax revenues generated and royalties are generated nowadays for the Trans Mountain pipeline, what would you point towards in the number value?
Oh, geez, it's in the billions in terms of the economic impact on an annual basis would be several $billion in terms of royalties, taxes, jobs, and the trail-on effect of that.
If you could go back to the start of the project,
what
would you have done differently?
I've been asked that before, and I've always said the same thing. I would have not underestimated the effect of local interests and political interests. We underestimated the effect that local communities and politicians could have on the project. And I didn't listen to their voices strongly enough and early enough. I would have done that better. I would have reconciled that piece of the puzzle more actively early on rather than fighting against it. We ultimately did, but it took some years, I think, for us to shift our attention to not just hearing what locals had to say, but responding to it in a way that was meaningful. I would have done that differently. I also, as I said earlier, wouldn't have tried to estimate the cost of it so early. I would have waited to estimate that cost publicly a little bit later.
And so knowing what you know now, do you think new pipelines and maybe LNG will
100%. 100%. I think if the market is there for it, we have to go back to first principles, which are supply and demand. Mm-hmm. If there is the supply that can be produced and and available to sell at a reasonable cost, and the market is there to pay for it in a reasonable fashion, then for sure we can build more pipe, and we can learn from what we've done, whether it's CGL or it's my pipe or the experiences with Keystone. We can learn from those experiences in order to, I think, chart a more favorable path forward that is less risky for investors and therefore more ripe for investor capital.
And as we look to the West Coast nowadays with LNG emerging, if given your experience, if you were to give advice to someone leading a project like that, what would be 2 or 3 things that you tell them
I would say I wouldn't even go into any regulatory process without having first solved for what the Indigenous economic participation was going to be in that project. I would partner with affected communities first, even before I start seeking permits and approvals. I would treat them as an economic partner in the project. And I think that takes the government to provide some government support for loans, et cetera, that would have to be taken. But I would do that first. The second thing I would do is I would put people on the ground in communities affected day one. Not people flying in from Calgary or Edmonton or Vancouver. I would establish local presence in impacted communities, whether that's a port or a pipeline or a hydro transmission line or a mine site. Put people in locally to become part of the community, to listen to the coffee shops, to listen to the local gatherings around impressions and thoughts of the work we're doing. So both of those are very much localizing the impact. And I think tailing on that, as we talked about earlier, from day one, get granular on what the local impacts are, both what you might be doing to change the environment and what you're doing to mitigate that and what benefits you're leaving behind, and keep localizing that. I mean, big Conference Board of Canada reports are kind of nice to wave around, but they don't translate as well as local impacts do.
That's a few thoughts on your last 30 years.
Yeah.
What are you up to nowadays? I think you're retired more or less, but you're on a few boards.
I'm retired, but I'm doing a few things. I'm working with Energy Alberta on their nuclear plant proposal up in the Peace River region. I'm working with some private equity that's invested in a pipeline up here. I'm advising them, Stonepeak Capital. I'm sitting on a few boards. I'm sitting on the board of an Indigenous energy services company. Just joined the Calgary Chamber of Commerce board, so I'm keeping busy.
Relatively busy.
Yeah.
And are you in Calgary nowadays?
Yeah,
full time?
Calgary, yep.
I really appreciate your time today.
Hey, I enjoyed it. Thanks very much.
And a quick thank you to David Schneider at Align Capital Partners for connecting us.
Yes. Thanks, Dave.
That's it.
Thanks, Trevor.